I'm going to do a video on three of, at least in my opinion, the best ways to deal with anxiety. And the first comes from a very old story in the East about a Chinese farmer, but I'm going to tell it kind of in an updated version that Eckhart Tolle tells. And it goes something like this. There's a guy who wins the lottery, and all his friends come around and they pat him on the back and say how lucky he is. And his only response is, maybe. And he goes out and he buys his fancy car, ends up getting into an accident and winds up in the hospital. And all of his friends go around his bedside and just, oh, with such sympathy, we feel so bad for you. This is so tragic. And he just responds, maybe. And it turns out while he was in the hospital, a storm had been so severe that it had washed his house down the side of a cliff. And if he had been home, he most certainly would have died. And again, his friends show up at the hospital and say, wow, you're just so lucky. And he just pauses and he says, maybe. And it's a great story because it really embraces the wisdom of unknowing. And so, how does anxiety connect with the idea of knowing and certainty? Well, it turns out the two sides of the brain have different functions. Our ancestors had to deal with almost uncertain situations all the time. Now, again, if someone says, I'll give you $1 million or I'll kick you in the shin, that's an easy decision. But in real life, decisions are made almost with uncertain probabilities. And so the left side of the brain has this function of pretending like it's certain. It pretends like it actually knows when it doesn't. And that's how it creates interpretations about the world. It forgets all the possibilities and it rests on one and only one. And that's the way it makes a decision. The problem is that that also creates anxiety because the decisions it's making are not at all necessary. And so the right brain has a totally different function. The right brain embraces uncertainty. It embraces the unknown. It keeps all possibilities open simultaneously. Now, some of you think, well, that's the thing I'm actually fearing. That's what's creating my anxiety, the unknown. But that's not true. The unknown has never caused anxiety. Anxiety stems from thinking you know what's going to happen. So I'll put a link in the description of a video I did previously about 5 tricks to get the right brain going. And if you can get the right brain going and if you can embrace uncertainty and admit to yourself you just don't know, then you'll see some of the anxiety mellow out a little bit. The second trick comes from another old saying, whatever resist, persist. And there have been only a few philosophers, actually, rather than psychologists, that have picked up on this idea. The mind works in a very opposing manner. So if you try not to be anxious, that creates your anxiety. And you know this if you've ever had to get up real early in the morning and you've tried to go to sleep. And the more you try to go to sleep, the more you're up all night. And so one of the ways that we can do this is just to recognize this, is to recognize that it's you're trying not to be anxious that creates anxiety. But here's the problem with this, and it's a very tricky paradox, because if we're honest with ourselves, we realize we don't want to be anxious. I mean, that's the truth of it. And it's the same way that you really do want to go to sleep if you've got an early appointment. And so that creates a problem because how do we control this when we honestly we can't? And it's our trying not to that's actually making it happen. Well, the second part of this is a problem of identity. So imagine you're walking out of a store and you see some stranger's car that has a huge gash in it. It really doesn't faze us too much. But if you walk out and you see your car has that same gash in it, then all of a sudden you kind of freak out and you feel all those emotions. It's because you attach your identity to that car. And that's the thing. It's our ownership of these thoughts that's actually creating our anxiety. So the second point is to really learn to become the observer of our anxiety, to watch it and pretend almost like it's that stranger's car. It's not ours. So there's another old Zen story that helps us with this, and it is an issue of control. And just to help us understand that we we shouldn't be identifying with our thoughts and feelings, particularly with anxiety, in particular because we don't control our anxiety. And so the old story is about a student who had an anger problem, and he went to his master and he's like, "You've got to help me because I've got a really bad anger problem." And the master said, "Well, show me your anger." And the student said, "Well, I can't really do that because I don't have any control over it." And the master said, well, then it's not you and it's not your problem. And that's the exact same thing to remember with anxiety. The very fact that you can't control it means that it's not who you really are. And that helps us kind of stand back and kind of watch it from a distance. Um, the third trick here is also, I don't know which one of these is, I didn't put them in any particular order. And it comes down to realizing the relationship between our thoughts and feelings and our actions. Um, and one of the things I've noticed is just, and I'm sure you have too, is everything with the media is cranked up, and we're all focused on our anxiety right now. And the problem is that anxiety is a thinking problem, at least on a surface level. And if you recall, one of Einstein's more famous sayings is that you can't solve a problem at the level at which it was created. And so you really can't solve a thinking problem by thinking about it. And the very famous American psychologist philosopher William James knew this absolutely, and he knew the relationship between our thoughts and our behaviors. And in his theory of emotion, he suggested that, and it's a pretty radical thing I've talked about before, that imagine you're walking through the woods and a bear jumps out. And the way we interpret it is we think, well, I'm anxious, I'm afraid, and then I start to run. And William James said that's exactly backwards. He said, no, that's not how it works. You actually start to run, and only when you're running are you actually afraid. So the third point isn't one I make a lot, but it's a very important one. It's that the mind follows what we do. And so when we deal with anxiety, we have to be very careful about what we do. And that's the problem. Because there's so much exposure in the media, because this is the main topic of conversation, we find ourselves doing a lot of what the mind interprets as anxiety. And so how do we fix this? Well, don't do anxiety. Do happiness. I mean, if you want to be happy, do happiness. If you want to be grateful, do gratitude. If you want to do peace of mind, um, you'll find that peace of mind will follow after the doing. And so we do have control over our actions. And so take a break from the conversation. Um, as I suggested before, it's warming up. So if you can take your shoes off and do a little grounding, that's one of the tricks to almost immediately slow down the activity of the left brain and kind of get into that moment of embracing the uncertainty, because that's a certain reality. We never know what's going to happen. We live in this world where the left brain, the mind, it feels like it has to pretend like it knows. And that's one of the things that really creates anxiety. So those are the three hints. I think they all work together and reflect well and as a package. And so let me know how those work for you.